She wasn't living in my house. She was hiding inside the spaces I never thought to check. Content warning: these stories include stalking, harassment, and intrusion. If this might hurt to hear, pause now and breathe. Your safety comes first. Now, let me pull you into something far more unsettling. Picture the place where you feel untouchable: your locked gate, your familiar yard, the person whose smile makes you believe nothing bad can reach you there. Hold that image. Now, imagine a thin crack forming in it. Not from a monster, not from a scream, from a person who appears harmless, someone who watches before you even notice they're looking. That's the thread connecting all three stories tonight. Different homes, different lives, but the same quiet horror underneath. Someone finding a way to live inside your life without permission. And it all starts with a man who walked by my fence and the dog who sensed the danger long before any of us did. I lived in a military town then, a place where most doors were half ajar with trust. We trusted neighbors because we had to. My husband was away on a deployment that made the small house feel twice as quiet. We had a mastiff, big enough that people crossed the street to avoid him, gentle enough that kids would sneak his ears when they thought no one was looking. His name wasn't important. His presence was. He made the backyard feel like a shield. Dwayne started off as the kind of neighbor you nodded to at the gate. He'd walk past every morning, hat pulled down, hands in his pockets, like he was taking a jog that ended precisely at our sidewalk. He'd pause, just long enough for a hello and a little too long for anything truly casual. At first, it was the harmless small talk: the weather, the leaf pile on our curb, which dog park had fewer off-leash people. You let those things pass because you live in a community. You smile, you wave. Then, one afternoon, when the house felt emptier than usual and the mail was the loudest sound in the kitchen, Dwayne stopped at the gate and talked like we were old friends. Not polite, not neighborly, the kind of overshare you only get when people are either drunk or watching you very closely. He told me things about my life that he shouldn't have known. That my husband was gone, that I'd been sitting on the back steps smoking when he passed earlier that week, that I kept the curtains drawn on the north side. He knew little domestic rituals, details like the way I refilled the soap by the sink, the grocery bag that always hung from the inside knob. He delivered these facts with the casualness of a man telling you what he had for breakfast. At the time, with my defenses already half lowered because of sleepless nights and the steady ache of missing someone who kept a time zone between us, I told myself he was just talkative. He was a man with a memory for faces, I thought. He liked to keep up with people, that was all. We made the mistake, so many of us do. We built excuses for the ways a stranger knew too much. The boundary that morning was a slow thing. It wasn't broken in a single cliff fall. It fractured in hairline cracks. The wave that was too knowing, the look that lingered too long, the way he'd turn his head slightly when my car left the driveway and then pretend he'd been looking at a tree. One evening, after a week of these little invasions, I stepped into the backyard to smoke, an old nervous habit I hated, and the backyard seemed inexplicably exposed. The chain link behind the privacy panels made the shadows longer. My mastiff sat near the gate, like he always did, and at first nothing happened. Then, without warning, the dog's muscles tightened, his ear twitched. A low, guttural sound rose from his chest, not a bark yet, but the preface of it, and it had the unmistakable weight of warning. And then I saw Dwayne. He wasn't coming down the sidewalk. He was 3/4 of the way up the driveway, one foot on the concrete, one hand resting, improbably, on the fence. He hadn't knocked. He had stood at a distance so close he could have read the tiny logo on my shirt. For a half second, we looked at each other like two animals trying to decide who would back away. He raised his hand in a wave that tried too hard to be casual. The mouth smile did not reach his eyes. My mastiff, suddenly enormous in the dusk, lost his mind. It was the kind of bark that makes your marrow cold, the explosive, furious sound of a creature that has decided something is wrong and is utterly done with negotiation. He charged the small stretch of yard like he'd been held back by invisible leashes his whole life, and Dwayne froze with his grip on the fence. The man's face changed in the way a person's face changes when it realizes he's been seen doing something he shouldn't have been doing. For a moment, he looked panicked. Then he did something that still sits in my ribs when I think of it. He gave a ridiculous, forced little wave, a hand that wanted to be neighborly but read as apology, and he turned and walked away. He stopped coming by after that. For weeks, we kept the blinds closed and put the mastiff's leash by the back door like a ritual. When my husband came home, I felt the house shift back into something that resembled normalcy. But it wasn't a return so much as a rearrangement of fear. Dwayne didn't return our waves. Maybe he moved. Maybe he kept walking past other yards. Maybe he watched other houses with the same little smile. We never called the police. We told ourselves we were lucky the dog had been there, that we had a protector who could read the air better than we could. We told ourselves a lot of things to make the nights quieter. What stayed with me was not a single confrontation, but the knowledge that someone had been close enough to map the rhythms of my home. The true terror wasn't a break-in that night. It was the realization that closeness can be a soft pretext for observation, a wave, a favor, an offer to walk a dog. It's that gap between what you think is ordinary neighborliness and the way it can be used to know you, to plan around the edges of your life without your consent. If this is holding your attention, take a second to like the video, just a tiny gesture, and stay with me. There are 2 more stories like this, and they darken in different ways. We move campuses now. Imagine fluorescent lights buzzing above a narrow hallway, a smell of instant coffee and detergent, and thin walls that let you hear whispers and laughter 3 rooms down. College dorms are their own kind of intimacy. Everyone's lives overlapping in the shared, the mundane, the momentary. The person you let borrow sugar could be the person who learns enough to follow you home. That's how the second story starts, with a nickname that should have been harmless. We called her Popcorn because she'd once set a bag in the microwave and left it too long. The little blackened kernels plastic stuck to the bag smelled like burnt sugar for days. And the nickname stuck because we were young and cruel in ways we didn't know better. At first, she was the quiet, oddly charming type who nosed into a room like she belonged. She was thin and quick, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes in the same way Dwayne's didn't. I met her when she knocked, across the hall, hands shaking with the weight of something she'd keep as a secret, and then offer me a version of it in the hushed tone of someone seeking shelter. She told me she'd been hurt. She said words I won't repeat and that I won't dramatize. And she asked me to walk her to the dining hall once, just to make sure she felt less alone. I did it because I believed her. I did it because we were taught, in messy ethics classes and in late-night hallway conversations, to be kind. Being kind became a series of open doors. She took those doors as invitations. At first, the calls were small. Texts asking if I'd seen her in the hallway, messages that landed at 1 in the morning and made you sit up because you weren't supposed to be awake then. Then came the calls that looped into long, rambling monologues about her life, the ones that used the word we, even though we were not a we. She would show up unannounced, standing in the doorway like a humidity that won't clear, her expression pinned in that almost smile. People told me to set boundaries. I tried. I said no to coffee, no to late-night movies, no to lending her my notes. Sometimes she accepted it, like she understood a rule. Sometimes she didn't. It's easy to think at first that someone like Popcorn is simply lost and will find her way, that with time she'll learn the lines you draw. But this is what boundary pushing looks like in the slow, precise way of an animal that skirts the edges of an invisible fence until the toy you left becomes part of its nest. She learned my schedule. She learned my patterns. She learned, in small breadcrumbs, the ways to insert herself where she was not wanted. She started calling constantly, half pleas, half accusations. If I didn't answer, she would stand outside my dorm room and sing, the lyrics warped into something obsessive. If I shut my door, she would knock until the wood rang. She slipped notes under the door with handwriting that looked disturbingly like mine sometimes. She started leaving small objects on my windowsill, a key I did not recognize, a Polaroid that showed the hallway outside my door at 3 in the morning. I told the RAs. I told the boyfriend who lived with me at the time. The first reports felt like splotches on a form, an attempt to translate an emotional hurricane into checkboxes and ink. Unwanted contact, wrote the RA, with the bureaucratic calm of someone who has to file 30 reports before lunch. They interviewed her. They warned her. She promised to stop. For a while, it seemed like the system's gears had slowed her down. But the problem with someone who has made attachment into a weapon is that they can be very patient. They can change tactics. She began to escalate in ways that were designed to unsettle. She'd duck into a bathroom stall near mine and hum. She'd shuffle and moat under the door while I was showering. Once, I remember the cold chain of air when I realized someone had slipped a slender hand under the gap of the stall as I sat on the toilet. No violence, but an invasion so intimate that it erased the thin skin of privacy that dorm life pretends to offer. On another night, she banged on the door at 2 in the morning like she was trying to pound the walls of sleep out of me. The boyfriend, who up until then had been the muscle of the house and the patient ear, warned her once, louder than he needed to, and that seemed to make her retreat for a few days. But her silences were never really recesses. They were pauses between storms. Then she crossed a line that couldn't be filed away as a misunderstanding. One evening, with my boyfriend in the room and me doing homework at the desk, there was a noise at the door, like the sound of someone deciding to break something polite. The knob rattled. The door swung inward. Popcorn stood there, like she'd always had a custom of opening doors that weren't hers. She stepped into the room without asking, eyes burning with a kind of entitlement that had been honed by months of being allowed to come close. It happened fast. What I remember most clearly is the sound of my own heartbeat behaving as if it were a separate living thing, a rapid drum that drowned out everything else for a second. My boyfriend stood up, like a human reaction, a pivot of protective motion, and he pushed her to the edge of the doorway with a force that was less than it felt like and more than the situation deserved. It was ugly for a moment. She didn't leave right away. She stood there, blinking, like she was recalibrating the physics of our relationship. Then she walked away, but not with a dignified retreat, more like a retreat that promised return. That night, we called campus police. They came, notebooks open, questions asked with the efficient, clipped concern of people trained to document rather than to comfort. Popcorn was known to them, they said. She had prior incidents, they said. Eviction was on the table, they said. We felt, for the first time in weeks, like something might actually change. But institutional responses have teeth that often bite only as deep as policy allows. An eviction notice cannot fix a voicemail you get at 3 in the morning where someone breathes on the line. A reprimand in an RA's file doesn't stop a person from learning the rhythm of your day and working around it. The campus could take actions that would remove her from the building, but removal is not always the end. It's a bandage over a problem that had been fed for months by inattention and by a kindness that had been mistaken for permission. After she was forced out of the dorm, following a string of incidents that the administration eventually marked as pattern, there were calls that continued. A voicemail, heavy breathing, captured and left like a token. The line of harassment morphed into something that could not be easily boxed. I tried blocking numbers and changing my routine, but blocking does not erase the sense of being watched. It does not stop the sound of someone standing near a window at night, humming the tune of a song you can't quite remember, but that is now synonymous with dread. There are few things more corrosive than being made to feel unsafe in your own small world. The emotional residue is not theatrical. It's the nightly calculation of who will be home, the reluctance to walk the same path twice, the way you keep your phone in your hand in case it rings. The kindness I offered out of compassion turned into an apparatus that someone used to build proximity. That realization did not make me callous, it made me careful. At this point in the story, the campus had taken steps. She had been removed from the scene, and for a moment there was relief. But that relief felt like a thin cover, paper over a shiver. It's one thing to see someone ejected from the place they have been invading. It's another to trust that they will stop finding ways to come back. The worst moments were not the confrontations themselves, as ugly as they were. The worst was what came after. The persistent hum of anxiety, the reshaping of routine, the feeling that your compassion had been weaponized against you. I want to stop here for a breath, because the next story gets darker in the way it slinks beneath the floorboards. The first two incidents, Dwayne at the fence and popcorn at the dorm door, are variations on a theme: a familiar face, a small kindness, a slow encroachment. The third story isn't about a neighbor who watches from a distance or a dorm mate who will not accept boundaries. It's about someone who literally made a home inside another person's house without their knowledge, a hiding that turned the underbelly of a family's life into a place of horror. This third story begins with a second-floor apartment, a small toddler who learns the world in the space between two stairwells, and a back door that was habitually left unlocked because neighbors helped each other. In a building like that, there is a social contract of convenience: rideshares and borrowed sugar, a shared roll of paper towels in a pinch. The mother in this story left the back door unlatched sometimes because the downstairs neighbor had a habit of popping up to pass food to her child, because the landlord had once mentioned he'd be in and out fixing a leaking pipe, because when you are exhausted, you do not want to struggle with a stubborn latch at 1 in the morning. For a little while, things were ordinary in the brittle, daily way they are for parents with toddlers: small shoes lined by the door, cereal chewed into the couch cushions, the soft whir of a baby monitor tuned to the next room. Then, gradually, small items began to go missing: a pair of toddler socks from the laundry, a favorite sippy cup that reappeared days later in an odd place, the oddness of a towel replaced by another towel that wasn't yours. At first, you lost things and blamed sleep-deprived mornings. You blamed the toddler because toddlers are master misplacers. But the losses kept accumulating in a pattern that did not feel accidental. She heard a noise in the back stair once while she was in the shower, a faint thing, the kind of anonymous scrape that you let go because the hot water has you in its own private world. She told herself it was the neighbor, someone coming home late. She told herself a lot of things to avoid the jab of fear. And then, one day, after a week of things vanishing and the odd creak of the back stair that couldn't quite be explained away, the landlord went down to check the basement. The basement was the kind of place that smells like everything that has ever been a project in a house: a mixture of damp and old cardboard and a sweetness of something that had been left too long. It was also, as so many basements are, supposedly empty. But in the back corner, tucked like a terrible secret, someone had built something close to a bed. Blankets were arranged in a way that looked almost domestic, an attempt at comfort thrown in the shadow of the foundation. There were bags with small items, things that matched the descriptions of things that had been disappearing from upstairs. At first, you lost things and blamed sleep-deprived mornings. You blamed the toddler because toddlers are master misplacers. But the losses kept accumulating in a pattern that did not feel accidental. She heard a noise in the back stair once while she was in the shower, a faint thing, the kind of anonymous scrape that you let go because the hot water has you in its own private world. She told herself it was the neighbor, someone coming home late. She told herself a lot of things to avoid the jab of fear. And then one day, after a week of things vanishing and the odd creak of the back stair that couldn't quite be explained away, the landlord went down to check the basement. The basement was the kind of place that smells like everything that has ever been a project in a house: a mixture of damp and old cardboard and a sweetness of something that had been left too long. It was also, as so many basements are, supposedly empty. But in the back corner, tucked like a terrible secret, Someone had built something close to a bed. Blankets were arranged in a way that looked almost domestic, an attempt at comfort thrown in the shadow of the foundation. There were bags with small items, things that matched the descriptions of things that had been disappearing from upstairs. Drug paraphernalia was present in the way basements often betray a life beyond the polite front of a home. And there were photos, Polaroids perhaps, or phone prints, square and stark, of the mother sleeping in her bed. Images captured through the thin barrier of a window, or perhaps taken through a door left ajar, of the private life of the woman and her child. The man in the basement, living like a creature in the underworld, had a nest of small possessions and a camera with pictures that eroded the last pale line between safety and observation. The landlord found him there. The man was not what you might expect. He was disheveled, maybe high, maybe hungry, eyes too open in the way of a person who's been sleeping in pockets of sleeping in wrong places. Reports say he lunged at the landlord when discovered. There was a scuffle, the kind of frantic thing that happens in minutes and is remembered in long, slow reels afterward. The man fled, from the corner of the basement to the trash, where he reportedly hid, like some grotesque animal that had been unmasked and desperately sought to become invisible again. Police were called. He was arrested, and for a beat the mother and the neighborhood felt a kind of brittle relief. But arrests do not always keep secrets from being secrets. The charges were later dropped or diminished in ways that made the mother's mouth taste like rust when she tried to speak about it. The legal end did not feel like an end. There was no justice that could ease the constant small terror, no recompense for the knowledge that someone had been beneath the floorboards, watching you breathe in your child's sleep. The community altered gestures of neighborliness. The small kindnesses that once made life easier had become a liability. Locks were added. Nightlights were brightened. A toddler's footsteps were suddenly monitored like a precious thing. The moment the basement was opened is one of those images that sticks. The way the light fell into the dark corner and turned cheap blankets into the suggestion of a bed. The sight of photographs scattered like evidence. The weight of what it would have meant if, at another turn, at another moment, the man's presence had moved from hiding to harming. That hypothetical is a kind of ongoing torture. What if becomes a question you cannot shake off, and it carries the same terror as a list of things that might have happened. I'll stop this here, so the rest of the third story, the legal aftermath, the community response, and the long-term fear that settled like dust, has room to breathe. What I want you to carry with you from these first three accounts is not the sensational detail. It's the slow, grinding betrayal of ordinary life. The true horror is not theatrical violence. It's the way our patterns of kindness and neighborly trust can be turned into a map for someone else's trespass. It's the dog who knew before we did, the roommate we tried to help who wouldn't stop, and the basement where someone made a nest out of stolen moments. There's more to tell about each of these households, the institutional responses that felt ineffective, the subtle ways people changed their routines, the private rituals they adopted to feel something like safety. But right now, I want you to let that sink in. The closeness you offer can be seen as breathable air to someone who wants in, and the only real defense is the vigilance that leaves no space for excuses. If you're still listening, hold on. The next part takes us deeper into the ways systems failed these people and how a bruise on a life remains long after visible marks fade. If you're still listening, hold on. The next part takes us deeper into the ways systems failed these people and how a bruise on a life remains long after visible marks fade. After Dwayne stopped coming by, we did what people do when a danger is more felt than seen. We rearranged our lives around the gap he left. The Mastiff became not just company, but a ceremonial presence. Mornings began with a ritual check, blinds, locks, the little porch light that clicked on with a hum. I developed a new relationship with silence. It no longer meant peace so much as the space where something unreadable might be standing. When the phone rang at night, my muscles tightened before I reached for it. When a neighbor's car idled at the curb, I watched for a long minute before opening the door. The house felt like a body with a bruise you could not point to on the skin. People who haven't been watched often underestimate this slow erosion. Fear changes the small routines of a day, the path you take to your mailbox, the times you let your toddler play on the porch, the way you answer a knock. For me, it was a tightening around the edges. For others in these stories, it became a full-time recalculation. It's why institutions matter and why their limitations hurt so much. Take the campus system in the popcorn story. The RA forms, the meetings with campus police, the eviction paperwork. These were all mechanisms designed to keep people safe. They are also forms and boxes and lines of authority that move at bureaucratic speeds. Our call to the RA felt like the right move. The person in the office listened, and her face softened with sympathy. She recorded things in a tablet with slow efficiency, then told us what she could do: issue a warning, speak with popcorn, file a formal complaint. We did what we were told to do. We documented, we saved voicemails, we copied text messages into a folder that began to look like an evidence box made of Word documents and screenshots. And yet, when Popcorn came into the room uninvited, when she refused to take the word no as an answer, it was less a failure of policy than a gap between policy and the reality of attachment turned coercion. Policies can remove someone from a building. For the mother with the toddler, the discovery changed the relationship she had with the very structure of the building. Where before the back stairs had been a convenience, they now represented a vulnerability. Where before neighbors had been a network of small favors, they were now also potential lines of entry for something predatory. The landlord's discovery played out like a scene from a dark domestic fable. He went down to the basement because he had to fix a pipe, or because he was used to checking the property with the kind of habit that lets you spot when things are off. He found the man curled into blankets in the back corner. He found photos. He found the small items that matched the missing things from upstairs. There was a physical confrontation of the kind that imprints itself in quick images: a lunging movement, a grunt, the clatter of a struggle. The man fled and hid inside trash. It feels almost absurd to write that he hid in refuse, like a character trying to fold himself into invisibility in the most literal sense. Police were called. He was arrested. For a time, the house felt like it had its wrongness confronted. And then, as the woman told it, the legal end unraveled into a sour aftertaste. Charges were dropped or diminished in ways that did not make sense to the family. The precise legal reasoning was sometimes hard to parse. Victims were spoken to in a language of statute and threshold that felt distant from their lived terror. They were told something like insufficient evidence or procedural issues, words that sit in the mouth like small clinical stones. The sense of being left exposed returned with a chill. The man had been in the basement. He had taken photographs of a sleeping mother. The law sometimes needs more than that to carry a case forward. The woman was left with images in her head and a system that could not promise anything more than temporary removal. This is where the human cost becomes a civic problem. When systems cannot or will not deliver safety, the emotional labor of coping falls onto the survivors. They repair the locks, they change the locks again, they install lights, they move furniture to block unseen sightlines. They become architects of their own vigilance, which is a kind of invisible labor that drains time and energy. And even when the immediate threat is gone, the way people inhabit space is altered. A hallway that once held the noise of a toddler's laughter now becomes a place for checking and rechecking. A backyard is no longer a place to breathe. It is a border you guard. There are small, practical ways survivors fought back against the erosion of their lives. And I want to name those without pretending any of them are magical solutions. They documented everything. They saved voicemails and text messages. They took photos of damage and kept logs of times and dates when someone suspicious was near. They reached out to resources, counseling centers, victim advocacy groups, housing authorities. They asked landlords for clearer communication and for physical evidence to be handled in ways that might support the case. When the system could not press forward, they found community. Neighbors who would check on the toddler, friends who would sit on the porch after dark and keep a candle burning. Those alliances did not undo the harm, but they made the nights less dense. One of the things survivors repeatedly described to me was the oddness of being told to just call the police, as if the instruction alone was an answer. Calling the police was necessary, but it was not always sufficient. Officers arrived with methodical kindness or clinical detachment. They listened, they wrote reports, and sometimes they reiterated statutory limits. For the woman with the basement invader, the police arrest felt good for a day and then hollow when the case did not stick. For me and the Mastiff, the decision not to call law enforcement was a combination of fear and calculation. We worried about escalating things without proof, about involving neighbors unnecessarily, about whether an officer arriving with the wrong framing would create more chaos. All three stories reveal a pattern. The initial acts of noticing and kindness became the very mechanisms through which violation was possible. Dwayne's conversations, Popcorn's requests for walks, the neighborly habit of leaving a back door unlatched. These were ordinary gestures repurposed into access. That's the writing on the wall here. Boundaries are not just social niceties, they are shields. When those shields are eroded, when a stranger's attention morphs into surveillance, that ordinary life we count on becomes a liability. And beyond practices and policies is the interior work survivors must do to live with this knowledge. Grief is not only for the person we lost or the home we no longer have. It is also for the rupture of trust. There is a complicated mourning for the ease with which we once left our doors unlocked, for the thoughtless ways we once waved through fences, for the nights we walked to the corner store without checking for footprints in the gravel. The mourning is ironic because it asks us to give up a part of the communal life that once made things bearable. The small kindnesses, the willingness to take someone's word at face value. That loss is real, and it changes the way we relate to neighbors and strangers. A few details deserve their own weight because they keep coming up in survivor accounts. The sound of a dog understanding danger before a person does. The way a voicemail can feel like a physical invasion. The grotesque intimacy of someone photographing you sleeping. The Mastiff in my story was more than a pet. I have friends who describe their dogs as having seen things before they have, who pull and halt and make a particular sound that says, "Don't go." Create small agreements. If you don't pick up your child by a certain time, call this number. Cultivate acquaintances who will be willing to show up for no dramatic reason, just because presence matters. Ask for documentation from institutions. When you report something, ask for copies of the paperwork you filed. Get a case number. If you're on campus, keep copies of all emails from RAs and campus police. These details can matter later. Lean on professionals. Victim advocacy groups, counselors, legal aid, these people are trained to help you navigate the terrain that institutions make complicated. They can help you find ways to preserve your safety while also working within the systems available. Trust your instincts. This is not a police instruction. It is a human one. If your skin prickles, do not ignore it. The Mastiff's alarm was not a trick. Animals often sense things before we can name them, and our bodies frequently register danger in small ways. Honoring that sensation is not paranoia, it's prudence. None of these steps solves the fundamental problem. Predators find ways into ordinary life because ordinary life allows them small openings. But they do offer a way out of the particular kinds of paralysis that fear can cause. I want to make something clear because I know the impulse in these conversations is often to ask what the victims should have done. That line of questioning is both unfair and useless. These people were not careless. They were human. They responded with the empathy and trust that a humane community encourages. We should not punish the kindness of those who were harmed. Instead, we should look at the systems, the societal assumptions, and the cultural habits that make such kindness exploitable. There are a few images from these stories that do not leave my mind. The mastiff's charge at dusk, astonishing in its clarity, the sound still rings. The voicemail breath, small and intimate, in a way that makes it feel like a hand inside the house. The blanket nest in the basement, lit by a single beam that turned shopping bag clutter into something grotesquely domestic. Each image is like a pebble dropped into water. It expands outward into a pattern of behavior, fear, and adaptation. And yet, life continues in the ways it must. Windows get stronger locks, lights go on timers. People learn the choreography of safety measures that once felt unnecessary. They also learn to sleep in ways that conserve a kind of hope. Not the naive hope that nothing bad will ever happen, but the practical hope that with care, community, and some institutional responsiveness, the nights can feel less like war and more like rest. That kind of hope is small, pragmatic, and precious. Before I close, I want to say something to anyone listening who may recognize themselves in one of these stories. None of this is your fault. You did not cause someone's predatory behavior by being kind, by living with a dog, by leaving a door open in the honest exhaustion of life with a small child. Blame belongs with the person who violates boundaries, not with the person who practiced trust. If you are in immediate danger, call your local emergency number. If you are dealing with stalking, harassment, or domestic intrusion, consider contacting a local victim advocacy organization. Links and hotlines will be in the description of this video. There are people who can help you document abuse, help you navigate housing and police systems, and provide emotional support. You do not have to handle this alone. These stories end in different ways. Dwayne left the street, or at least he stopped walking past our gate. Popcorn was evicted from the dorm, but the sound of her presence remained as a long voicemail and as a lesson about the limits of compassion when it is not guarded with boundaries. The man from the basement was arrested, and then, in the legal system, the case did not land the way the family had hoped. In each version, the aftermath is messy, quiet, and persistent. There are no tidy Hollywood endings. Rather, there are adaptations, small, stubborn acts of survival, and a demand that communities do better by those who find their lives violated in moments both small and enormous. She wasn't living in my house, she was hiding. That phrase is not just literal in one story. It is a metaphor for the way danger can take up residence in the crevices of ordinary life. It hides in the gestures we make toward each other, in the overlooked corners of a basement, in the person we let borrow our kindness. The horror is not only the possibility of harm, it is the betrayal of trust and the slow learning that the worlds we take for granted are not always as safe as they appear. If this episode mattered to you, please consider subscribing and sharing an anonymized, safe version of your own experience in the comments, if you feel able. Keep identifying details out of the public comments for your safety. In the description, you'll find resources and hotline numbers for anyone affected by stalking, harassment, or domestic intrusion. If you can, share this with someone who needs to hear it. I'll leave you with this. Be kind, but be careful. Protect your kindness with boundaries. The two are not opposites. They are companions. Good night.